Assalamu alaikum, comrades. Today we're going to talk about bias in academia. You see, recently I had acquired this book called The Soviet Dream: World of Retail Trade and Consumption in the 1930s. I've been recently researching a lot about the view of items like cosmetics and the change of ideals towards fashion in the early Soviet Union pre-war. So I thought getting a book like this might be full of some useful information. Perhaps it'll tell me a bit about the process of manufacturing those kinds of items, which items were popular, maybe some statistics about who was using these items. But I could barely get through the introduction and the first chapter because it's terrible. This is your daily reminder that traditional academia is a scam, and just because someone works for an institution like a university doesn't mean that they know better than anyone else or do proper research. In fact, they're more inclined to do research and publish things that are aligned with the university that employs them. I just read this god-awful book that used the term Stalinist regime 20 times on every page. It's supposed to be about Soviet retail in the 1930s. Did I learn anything about that? No. If you're going to be incredibly negatively biased, at least admit that. Don't pretend to be unbiased. Anyone who says that their research or approach is unbiased is lying to you. And if they claim they're not lying and they truly believe that they're being unbiased, that's even worse because they're not even aware. My goal is to humanize the people of the Soviet Union and bring understanding for the reasons behind certain actions and ways of life. That's my bias. It's going to be overwhelmingly positive. Anything published in the English language or by an American university is going to inherently frame the Soviet Union as negative and less than the United States, worse off. This book straight up uses primary sources, accounts of Soviet citizens being amazed by the progress being made in the past 20 years, and immediately after will say they don't know what they're talking about. They may think that they were doing better, but I think some would disagree. No source on the some, though. Let me read to you part of the introduction so you get an idea of what we're dealing with here. The Soviet retail sector and consumer goods have come to epitomize all that is wrong with the socialist system and to explain why in the long run it could not last in the face of a capitalist West more capable of meeting the consumer needs of its citizens. Americans, would you agree? How are you doing? Can you afford groceries? Did you pay your rent on time? Have you ever had to resort to stealing groceries? How many homeless people did you pass today on the streets? I passed 7. Yeah. So that's me ticked off. I have very strong emotions in that I get saddened by things very easy, but it's really hard to get me actually angry. And when I'm angry, I guess I'm still nice to some people, but that video still upset others. Like, I feel like I was saying reasonable things, but it upset people. And let me insert some of the text here in regards to what I'm talking about with that bias, even using the primary sources and personal accounts and saying, she thought that, but she's probably wrong because others disagree. Not that I have an example of those others. Yeah, that was one of the most shocking things for me. Here's an example, an excerpt from a diary where they're basically explaining what it's like now in these new stores and saying, when you recall the first years after the revolution and the way things were back then, it's just exhilarating to think that all this has been achieved in just 20 years. So in response, she basically says that, it's better than what they're used to, which is poor quality and limited selection, blah, blah. And then they say that in regards to her remark that in general people do buy a lot, that others might disagree. No source on those who disagree with her experience, though. Stalinist regime. Then she says destroying the NEP leaves the future of Soviet retailing unclear, which the whole point of the book is supposed to explain the new vision and what they're now changing to. This is what we're dealing with. For example, I complained in that TikTok about how the author used Stalinist regime many times on every page, every opportunity and chance they could, literally every time referring to the government in any way for whatever reason. They would reference the government by calling it the Stalinist regime. as if to remind you again, this may in actuality sound like a good idea and a positive thing that they were doing for the people. A massive improvement to society, especially compared to the way things were under the Tsar for the average person who was an illiterate peasant. But it's actually done at the hands of the Stalinist regime. Does that undo the fact that lives were improved? It's a purely linguistic choice. And here's the thing, Stalinism isn't even a thing. I know. These days I try to stay away from the actual political science because I don't want to read the comments. They make me cry. But here I am saying it. Stalinism isn't a thing. Stalin was a Marxist-Leninist. There's no agreed upon contribution to Marxist thought specific to Stalin that warrants the actual categorization of Stalinism. It's not a study in political science in the same way that Marxism is, or Maoism, in that Mao actually added specific or locally, situationally unique practice on top of Marxism. Stalinism is only used officially to denote a specific time period, and blanketing a 30-year period over the largest geographic landmass with over 180 unique people groups, is that really efficient in any way? There's literally no reason to use Stalinism. It kind of denotes a time period, but that, again, as I mentioned, is very large and vast, and what's the point? What's the point at all? The language itself is flawed. And so I think it should be evident and clear that that term is primarily reserved to be used in a derogatory way, linguistically, or solely to discredit something. What good does it do to label everything that happened in the Soviet Union at the time Stalin was in charge as Stalinist? Be it good or bad, an improvement to society or a structure, or even an attempt gone wrong, so much was being tried for the first time ever. From the 1920s to the 50s, there were so many programs and attempts and changes in society, many that no one had ever seen or tried before. Not all of that's going to go well. Not all of it did. But a good amount was an extreme improvement to the way things were and influenced other nations in the West, like the United States. I mean, we even referred to the Soviet Union as the first socialist society for a reason. The point is, and the merit is in that things were tried, and improvements that were made successfully were due to the willingness of the people. Pre-war Soviet Union is so inspirational to me. What people were willing to sacrifice, what people were willing to do for the potential of the future, it's unmatched, and it's really wonderful to learn. So why does labeling this sort of inspiration, this joyous atmosphere, this willingness to do so much for one's country trying new things, what good does it do to label it as Stalinist? It only serves to discredit, and I think it's obvious. So it's not used as a way to factually credit a leader. Improvements made in the USSR was due to the leadership of the proletariat anyways. People voting and coming together in small communities and large. It wasn't one big swoop from above. There was actual functional structure to the government and the local representatives for the government. A book from much later on that might be helpful in understanding the Soviet structure of government would be The Soviet System of Government by John N. Hazard. I have the 5th edition revised, but I got this for like $4.99 on Thrift Books, and I'm sure you can find books that explain how things work in the function of different bodies. You can find those kinds of books out there. I also recommend reading the Soviet Constitution, different versions if you can, because they will vary on the time period that you are referring to. In the mid-1930s, Anna Louise Strong would help in producing a few different pamphlets that explained Soviet life, the Soviet view of things, the Soviet line, and answered commonly held questions by North Americans. In 1934, she came out with the pamphlet Dictatorship and Democracy in the Soviet Union, and there's a wonderful excerpt in there roughly explaining the structure of government, power, and authority. It says, and in Moscow, decisions based upon all these concentrated reports are made and travel outward to be discussed and adapted to provincial conditions. and to be again discussed and adapted to localities. The ultimate destination towards which the Soviet ship of state is steering was fixed by the revolution. The rate of speed and the daily or yearly course is charted by the Central Committee of the Communist Party to take advantage of varying winds and tides. Yet it is a course which every active worker and peasant takes part in fixing. It arises from the experiences of 3 million party members, and each of them keeping in touch with some section of the masses, all of them interacting, discussing, comparing results. Communists of longest experience and best records have the widest range of authority. But be it noted, they do not call it power. Power resides in decisions of the working masses. Authority is that prestige of character and knowledge which enables its possessor to make and interpret these decisions. She then goes on to say, it is authority rather than power that Stalin himself possesses. So again, I don't think you need to look too hard to understand the actual intent by using Stalinist regime in this book over and over again on a book that's meant to discuss early consumption habits in the Soviet Union. It's easy to see the intent in the language used, and that it's not just meant to be a factual statement. The language alone is indeed biased. It serves a clear purpose, and it is not to tell fair history. I know I don't need to say this, but of course this isn't meant to minimize anyone's experience or their own personal family trauma related to that time period, or perhaps associated with Stalin, or any of the things in that time period that did not go well, that was tried and failed. But this is all just something to consider in how we perceive these biases, how the facts can be skewed, and to help us better and more critically consume historical information. So I hope you can understand what I'm trying to say with that example of, labeling a 30-year period as Stalinist regime, and how that discredits anything that actually happened and doesn't help you understand what was happening or the structure. I do have some more book recommendations. One that I can't recommend enough, and it seems kind of silly. It's called 100 Questions and Answers about the USSR. It was published in the Soviet Union. There are many additions to this, but they all include the same sorts of commonly asked questions. Novosti Press Agency Publishing House, Moscow, 1986. So 1986 edition is the one that I have, but it literally covers everything from the official stance on religion, the average family income, like all of the top questions are in here and answered really well if you want to know the Soviet line and how things are officially dealt with. That doesn't mean that everything was dealt with to the T and 100% to the official Soviet line, but it does at least explain how it's meant to be handled and expected to be handled. No matter what edition you get, it's just a really good book for understanding things from a basic level. Again, this is a later book, but I do have a recommendation for a earlier book, and it is another pamphlet by Anna Louise Strong from 1936 called What About Russia? An Honest Reply to Honest Questions. Similar concept, answering common questions from the time, but through the lens of the 1930s. And of course, the pamphlet I already read from, Dictatorship and Democracy in the Soviet Union by Anna Louise Strong in 1934. You can read this pamphlet completely for free in PDF form in various places online, but you can specifically access it through Marxist.org, and I'll link that down below, as well as the names of all the books mentioned. This one isn't as neatly laid out in a question and answer format, but it does cover hot topics like the deportation of kulaks, what I previously read in describing the structure of things and the difference between power and authority, among many other fascinating topics. And her writing is very easy to digest and often uses great examples and juxtapositions specific to North America, if that's helpful for you. But yeah, that's what's been on my mind since I tried reading that book. I was so excited for the book. I really wanted to learn some things, and I know that when something's published in the English language, it often automatically means it's not going to be great, but there's always like some nugget of information hidden in these books. Even if they're inherently negative in their view towards the Soviet Union, you can still find useful information. You just have to shift through the language that makes it insufferable if you have leanings like mine, and inshallah you have similar thoughts as well. But sometimes I'm too naive and optimistic in that front. Anyways, if you'd like to support what I do here and make it easier for me to produce more content and access source material, for instance, I was recently able to purchase that pamphlet I mentioned about the questions and answers about the Soviet Union by Anna Louise Strong, although it is still coming in the mail. That's thanks to you, comrades. So consider either submitting a one-time donation through my PayPal, which will be linked below, or if you can commit to something more long-term, I have a Patreon, but all of these things are incredibly helpful in supporting the work that I do, because for the most part I do it for free, and because it is my life and I'm passionate about these things, and I really want to be able to share it with you. And inshallah one day I'll be able to afford to scan all of these items that I have for you to view for free. Recently we've seen like Z Library being taken down, and that might continue to happen. So having physical copies is really important to me. It's my favorite way of going about research, having everything all in front of me. And at some point I do plan to be able to scan it and give it to you all for free as well. Anyways, comrades, thank you for being here and listening to me complain a little bit about linguistic bias. I greatly appreciate it. So please be inspired by history and have a good day.